In this lecture, I want to make two broad points. The first is that people have different literacies, which they make use of, associated with different domains of life, and that these differences are increased across different cultures or historical periods. The second point is that people's literacy practices are situated in broader social relations. So that makes it necessary to describe the social setting of literacy events, including the ways in which social institutions support particular literacies. So let's go back to the first point, that people have different literacies which they make use of, associated with different domains of life. These differences are increased across different cultures or historical periods. So there's not one way of not one way of reading and writing. There's not one set of practices. An adult at home may be helping a child with homework, trying to understand a tax form, scanning through a local paper, looking online, and so forth, writing a phone message. Each of these involves very different literacy practices. So to take just any example, someone could be involved in a range of different sorts of literacies. You could be, the same person can be writing shopping lists and telephone messages, using the library, discussing news that you've read online or in a newspaper. The person might go to, that same person can go to the library, and even at the library you can be participating in a variety of different practices. You could be reading books, flipping through newspapers, renewing books, going online, looking at notices that are posted there. A variety, again, a person, and as we've discussed in this class, can be doing a variety of different practices in a relatively short period of time. So where these different practices cluster into coherent groups, it's useful to talk in terms of them as being different literacies. So a literacy is a stable, coherent, identifiable configuration of practices such as legal literacy or the literacy of specific workplaces. In multilingual situations, different literacies will often be associated with different languages or different scripts. These literacies are configurations of practices. So I think it's worth saying a little here about how they relate to each other. There's not a single dimension on which they can be placed from simple to complex or from easy to difficult. Schools do that in terms of instruction, believing that children learn from going from simple to complex, easy to difficult. But in reality, these configurations of literacy are far more complex than that and fly in the face of the ways in which schools imagine that teaching and learning should occur. So it's important to move beyond the idea that are both implicit and explicit in literacy programs for children, but also for adults as well, that there's a simple dimension from basic to complex forms of literacy. Literacies don't exist on some scales starting with basic or simplistic forms and going on to complex or higher forms. So-called simple and complex forms of literacy are in fact different literacies serving different purposes. They don't lead on from one to the other in an obvious way. Secondly, there's not a neat list of literacies. Although we don't want to end up with a closed taxonomy of literacies, it's nevertheless useful to identify different categories. So various suggestions have been made, and although they're often presented in pairs, such as categories, in fact, there really aren't usually polar opposites. So to begin with, literacies are not equally valued. And I want to repeat that. Literacies are not equally valued. And that's a crucially important point to think about schools and what we value or don't value in terms of a child or families in terms of their literacy. But they're not equally valued, and they vary in what purposes they serve. So one distinction has been between imposed uses of literacy and self-generated uses of literacy. I'm going to fix this right there. This emphasizes the importance of purposes. Sometimes these purposes are self-generated. At other times, such purposes are filling in official forms, so that they're imposed from the outside. So that relates to a distinction used by Brian Street. He refers to dominant literacies and vernacular literacies. So dominant literacies originate from the dominant institutions of society. Vernacular literacies have their roots in everyday life. Another possibility is indigenous versus imported literacies. A different sort of dimension is that some literacies are creative, allowing possibilities for the writer, while others, like filling in forms and checking lists, are constrained literacies. Although, in fact, all literacies probably have creative and constraining aspects. A further possibility is Paulo Freire's distinction between domesticating and empowering uses of literacy. So there's no one clear set of categories for the recurring configurations of written language. Literacies are identified culturally as such. So different literacies are associated with different domains of life, such as home and school and church and work. There are different places in life where people act differently and use language differently. So in an ecological metaphor, there are ecological niches which sustain and nurture particular forms of literacy. So to take the example of home, school, and work, typically people wear different clothes, talk differently, take on different roles, have different purposes. The social rules underlying people's actions in these three places are different. The physical spaces, buildings, are different, and time is broken up differently. There are different domains, and they give rise to different practices, meaning both the general social ways of acting and how people individually act on particular occasions. The second point that I want to address is that people's different literacies are associated, are situated in broader people's literacy practices are situated in broader social relations. This makes it necessary to describe the social setting of literacy events, including the ways in which social institutions support particular literacies. So in a day, people pass through many activities, each making different demands on them. They might be a parent, a spouse, a partner, a neighbor, a customer, a patient. In doing this, people draw upon different aspects of their identity. Some may be female, middle class, a mother, a student, but they will draw upon salient features of their identity in any given situation. So we say that people are positioned by rules and demands placed upon them. And in most situations, they know a range of appropriate ways of acting. People generally know what to do if they're a parent or a patient or a customer. Nevertheless, rules aren't fixed and unchanging things which people slot into. Rather, they're negotiated, accepted, and sometimes challenged. In any given situation, people can have more than one role, and there can be conflict between the demands of different roles. So given that many everyday activities can be literacy events, the idea of roles and identity are a good place to start an examination of social variation in and constraints on literacy. So it's in certain roles that people need particular literacies and use literacy. A simple example of roles and literacy events is that of gender in the home. Now, when I grew up, there was a very clear role for my mother and my father in terms of literacy. So, for example, my mother would write all the holiday cards. My dad would pay the bills. That may not be your situation, but it was mine, and you could imagine it in other situations, but you probably could also imagine how a common role division can be observed in your household or somebody else's household. Sometimes, and this is historically in the United States and other Western countries, that women write in the personal sphere, keeping contact with friends and relations, writing the holiday cards or birthday or anniversary cards, while men dealt with the business world of bills and mortgages and house repairs. Of course, these are changing, but take the point. And those roles can be followed to the extent that men are unable to write a personal letter and women not know how to write a check. At least, again, going back many, many years, but not as current. But it's just one example of that when we think about how might literacy be gendered. How might men and women potentially act differently? And again, not a hard and fast rule. And roles are not always obvious. Those roles are negotiated and can involve conflict and change. There was certainly a time in my own family when my mother took control of the finances. So anyway, so difficulties with reading and writing or particular skills can affect roles people have, as my father learned. People's literacy practices don't reflect abilities in any straightforward way, but rather they are to do with what people feel is or isn't appropriate. People learn socially that there are appropriate and inappropriate practices for specific roles. So viewing abilities like this represents an important shift in terms of how we think about literacy. The move toward describing people's actions as relative to the situation they're in is a significant step. It represents a move away from the over-reliance on the idea of a set of fixed abilities, which is common in much discussion of reading and writing, particularly learning to read and write. So in addition, we can't lose sight of the fact that roles are related to power and that much literacy is learned in relationships of unequal power, a parent and a child, or the teacher and student. The second consideration when situating literacy practices within broader social relations is that in everyday life, people act within various networks. These networks have broad functions covering work, child rearing, and other areas of social activity, and they're often networks of reciprocal support. Literacy activities are exchanged within these networks. There is interesting work, for example, on people who the dominant society considered to be illiterate, and illiteracy being a problem. But when you actually sit down and talk with people who are considered illiterate, they don't necessarily think of it as a problem. They are involved with networks and networks of support, people who might do some work for them, and in exchange, they like filling out official forms. And there it becomes a reciprocal relationship in which the person who may be considered illiterate will do help out the person who's helped them. So throughout, I'm starting out from how literacy fits into people's lives, how people experience literacy. But it's important to keep in mind, very important, the institutional framework which provides the context for people's actions. So an alternative starting point for a study of the social basis of literacy could be institutional practices around literacy, examining religion, capitalism, advertising, these as social practices. It's important to see how the state, the church, multinational corporations use literacy to plan, record, control, and influence, and how people participate in these practices. Human activities, including literacy, are embedded in and get their meaning from such institutions. So one way of examining different institutional settings is to regard them as different domains. For each of these domains, there are particular institutions which support distinct literacy practices. Particular definitions of literacy and their associated literacy practices are nurtured by these institutions. Different institutions define and influence aspects of literacy or different literacies. They become definition-sustaining institutions. So schools and the whole educational system, for instance, supports certain views of what literacy is and what it's for. Historically, different religions have developed distinct definitions of what literacy is and what it means to be literate. Taken together, the various institutions may support different literacies. For example, it may be that in a culture, religion influences religious aspects of literacy. The family has an effect on habits of personal communication. So while work and school influence public and formal aspects of communication, it follows from that that domains are not equal. And to some extent, the different institutions may be supporting conflicting literacy practices. In addition to that, there are larger concerns, such as gender or national identity, whose influence cuts across different domains.